Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Discovery Debrief, a podcast setting a course to discuss the future of the final frontier in Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, Lower Decks, and more. I'm co-host Chris Clow, and I'm joined by two members of our bold panel of Star Trek franchise explorers tonight, including Zaki Hasan.
Greetings.
And Cicero Holmes.
Scotty has been taking me around the Enterprise for the last 45 minutes, and damn, I'm tired.
Oh, man, that's very, very well said. That is the topic of discussion today, the primary topic of discussion, because we haven't been able to get together before then, but back on September the 15th, Fathom Events held a special 40th anniversary screening around the country of none other than Star Trek the Motion Picture. And it's a movie I'm very familiar with. All of us are very familiar with it, obviously, but it was my personal first time seeing it on the big screen. And I thought that it might just kind of be fun to get the panel together and talk about it. But before we do that, since it's been a while since we've all gotten together, let's check in with how our panel is doing. Zaki, what have you been up to, man?
I've been keeping very busy with work and travel, and my Star Trek rewatch is continuing along wherever I can. I'm up into the second season of Voyager, and that's concurrent with, I think, it's the fourth season of Deep Space.
Mm-hmm.
And I just watched, I think it's called Cold Fire.
Oh, I don't remember that one.
I don't remember that one.
That's a Voyager episode with Gary Graham as another Ocampan, and he teaches Kes how to boil people's blood, and she like.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Wow. Man. Well, okay. So that inevitably leads me to how your perception of Voyager continues to shake up, because I remember when you first got into it, you were kind of warming to it from, at least from what your previous perception was.
Yeah.
Is the warming continuing, or has it plateaued?
Yeah, man, it's like, I'm enjoying jumping back and forth between them. Like at this point, I've imbibed Deep Space Nine multiple times. So for me, the fun of that is like, well, this is a show I love and I get to watch it with my kids. And then when we have a Voyager, it's like, hey, here's a Star Trek I haven't seen,
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
And it's like anything. There's some are better than others. And I think even Voyager up through where we're at now, second season, some of them are hit harder than others. But it's like, I, for the most part, I like the characters. I can see why people generally dislike Neelix, because a little does go a long way. But I think I said this last time, my 10-year-old, he's like, oh yeah, I like Voyager better than Deep Space Nine. So he's all about that Voyager life.
I think that's an understandable perspective given his age. I mean, he very well could change that perception if he decides to continue watching the franchise, but
yeah.
It certainly seems more friendly to someone of that age, considering that they just kind of go out and have crazy adventures and then apparently eventually get mutated into lizards when they cross the transwarp area.
I'm going to skip that one. I will be skipping. I will say this though, and this is only tangentially connected, but I think it is applicable in some way. Just the other day, my wife was telling me that she was talking to one of the parents of the other kids in my kid's Boy Scout troop,
Mm-hmm.
And so her son is, he's on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And so he sees a therapist and whatever. And so his mom comes and pulls my wife and says, she's like, I need to talk to you about something. And my wife's like, oh my God, what? And she's like, my son, he talks to his therapist, and the therapist was like, how are people treating you, whatever. And this kid, he tells his therapist, he says, one person is always kind to me, and that's Mikhail. That's my son. He's in my troop with me, and he always takes time to talk to me. He's always nice to me. And my wife tells me this, and I had the thought, which I didn't bother telling her, but I'm telling you guys, I'm like, I'd like to believe that that's at least partly a result of this Trek life that I'm trying to walk them through,
Yeah. If I may, sir.
Yes.
I will say that you are correct because you have lived that Trek life and you have instructed your children and they are following in the footsteps and the pathway that you have set before them. And that has been informed, in no small part by the Star Trek universe.
Well said. We should all be so lucky.
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. Well, Cicero, what are you been up to, man?
Unlike I am reverse Zaki. I am he's wearing red and yellow and I'm wearing yellow and red.
Zaki is Hulk Hogan and you're Hollywood Hogan.
That is correct. Yeah, sucker.
Something, brother.
Right. All right, brothers, let me tell you. So unlike Zaki, who is doing a broadcast order rewatch, I am doing my de facto broadcast reverse order rewatch.
Oh, you are?
Or Star Trek shows. So, I am now in the third season of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. The thing that I realized again is, so Deep Space Nine came out about the same time. It premiered in my senior year of high school, but it really started to catch its rhythm as I was in college without the ability to stick around and stay very engaged in it. And over the years, I've definitely dabbled in and out of the show. And was able to appreciate its greatness, even with the limited amount of knowledge that I had of the show. And now I am actually getting a chance to watch it in its entirety as it was meant to be watched. And I'm really starting to appreciate it for what it is. But the thing that I think we attribute, the reasons that we attribute, Deep Space Nine as to being the best version of all of these Star Trek shows up into, and, depending on how it winds up, Discovery, hasn't really happened yet. So I think we're getting to the point where that is starting to happen. And that is the serialized nature of Deep Space Nine. Mm-hmm. Up until, through the first two seasons, spoilers for those people who haven't watched DS9 yet. The first two seasons are very serialized. They have set, in the first couple of episodes, they set up for everyone who the principal players are, the setting, the hook, which is the wormhole and the access to the Gamma Quadrant. All of those things are kind of set up. But then after those things are set up in the first couple of episodes, and actually in the very first double-size episode, you can kind of dive in. You can jump in and jump out wherever you want over the first 2 or 3 episodes, and you can watch that episode in a vacuum, and really walk away fulfilled. But it's not until, I think that DS9 really kind of gets its legs when it starts to become more serialized, where you've got these 3 or 4 or 5 episode arcs that are happening where like you really need to stay tuned and stay involved in what's going on. And I think, there was something that, they talked about in What We Left Behind, the amazing documentary, that came out about, Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Now available on Blu-ray.
That is correct, sir. Check your local Blu-ray distributor. They talk about, how Avery Brooks was not allowed to, I guess,
to be Avery Brooks.
adorn himself the way that he felt most comfortable.
Right.
Which is with facial hair and no head hair, bald with a goatee. And instead he was, low cropped haircut, with no naked facial hair. And that, he didn't feel comfortable in that way. And the thing that I started to realize as I'm watching the show, and you can always attribute lots of knowledge after the fact, of course, right? Like the thing that I attribute that to is, and I think it's kind of apropos, is Avery Brooks's physical appearance didn't change until the Deep Space Nine audience was comfortable with him, and also until the Deep Space Nine writers and creators were comfortable with themselves in the show. In like, there was a proving time, not only for Avery Brooks as the lead, as the number one person on the call sheet, being a person of color on that show, and how those dynamics worked with him being a father, a single father, and all of the things that came along with that. I think all of those things were proving moments for themselves and for the show, but also for him as an actor for this genre. And then once they felt like they successfully did that, everything changed. So his physical appearance changed, and the type of show it was changed. Once they realized that they had their people hooked, they had them sunk in, then it really dramatically changed into the show that we know and love.
Very, very well expressed. Yeah, I think that's they did very much try and drive that point home in the documentary, but the way that you express that is very much appreciated, and all the more appropriate because the night we're recording this is October 2nd, which actually marks Mr. Brooks' 71st birthday. So
happy birthday, Mr. Brooks.
Happy birthday to Avery Brooks. Before we move on to the primary discussion, we also do have to mention that there was some sad news in the world of the Star Trek universe relatively recently with the passing of actor ARON EISENBERG, who played Nog on Deep Space Nine. Did such a phenomenal job. And Cicero, in a way, I envy you, because you could be very well absorbing some of the most memorable and kind of heart-wrenching episodes that feature that character in particular.
Right.
And I was devastated to hear the news of Mr. Eisenberg. I never had the chance to meet him, but I know a whole lot of people who have, and they always say that he was extraordinarily gracious whenever people would meet him at conventions. And he just seemed like a good quality human being who lived that Trek life as well. And I'm sorry now that I'm never going to get the chance to meet him. But Zaki, what did you make of hearing the news of Mr. Eisenberg's passing?
So he was someone who I was connected to on Facebook and Twitter, and I had interacted with him, not a lot, but a fair amount. Mm-hmm. And he always struck me as being very genuine, and I found his reflections on playing the role that he expresses in the documentary very moving. He is moved to tears at times, and you can see why being identified with a character like Nog would mean so much to someone who had to deal with the health and physical struggles that he had. And I will say, and this, apropos of nothing, I guess, but this past Saturday, I'm driving along and I'm like, I should just DM him and see about getting him on my Nostalgia Theater show. And I was like, yeah, when I get a chance, I'm going to do that. And then I wake up Sunday morning. To, I think it was James Cawley on Facebook was like, I just got word that ARON EISENBERG died. And I'm like, holy moly. I wouldn't even bring this up except for the synchronicity of that happening exactly as I said it.
Right. Sure.
And it's obviously, he was a role model on that show, but for whatever it's worth, he will continue to be a role model on that show. Nog will never die, and as such, neither will ARON EISENBERG.
Absolutely. Very well said. Well, I think everybody, we all send our thoughts to Mr. Eisenberg's friends and family, and we're sorry to see him go, but he leaves behind one incredible legacy. Cicero?
I just want to say that in What We Left Behind, you can really see the love and the passion that he had for the role. And usually what happens when you have these retrospectives about a show that has lasted for a long period of time, a show where the fandom is still very, very vocal and active, even years after the show has ended, you'll get, and especially when you have an ensemble cast, right, you will have actors in two disparate camps. You'll have the guys that it was the best time of their lives. They love interacting with the fans. They love the recognition of it. And they think wistfully of those days, that they had on set and, it was the best time of their lives. And then there's the other camp where, hey, look, it was a gig and going to these conventions is another gig, but I really wish I could just remain a working actor and have other things that people remember me for as opposed to just this one role. ARON EISENBERG was definitely part of the latter group, or part of the former group as opposed to the latter group. And, you could tell how, like, as Zaki said, how passionate he was about, the performance that he put forth, as Nog, and what the creators and the writers and the costume people were able to create for him so that he could use that as a vehicle to create and inspire and to entertain us, the fans, as that character. And he, it was the best times of his life. And he was definitely one of those people who really, really, really enjoyed, seeing the joy in everyone else's faces. And, those are the best damn people. And we lost a great one. Yeah. And, rest in power, man.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, yeah. With that, love and thoughts to Mr. Eisenberg's friends and family. But let's move along to our discussion, revolving around the theatrical exhibition for the 40th anniversary of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So let's kind of go through briefly for each of us our stories of first encountering this movie and whether or not that involved going to the theater. Zaki, why don't we start with you? Did you see this movie in the theater?
Initially, no. I beat this movie into the world by 2 months.
Yes, that'll do it.
However, that did, however, have the effect of really, because of my older brother, who he was 5 years older than me, and he was a Star Trek fan. It is the vehicle that introduced Star Trek into my life, pretty much from the jump. And I've told this story elsewhere that, I grew up watching T.J. Hooker. Mm-hmm. And so my brother would be like, "Oh, this is T.J. Hooker in space. That's Captain Hooker." and I was like, "All right," because I'm like, well, my brother wouldn't lie to me, and I still give him shit about that to this day. But like, I mean, I always like, the motion picture was my introduction to Star Trek. The Wrath of Khan is what turned me into a Star Trek fan.
Sure.
Excellent. Sure. Cicero, did you see this movie in the theater?
So I did see this movie in the theater. Back in the day, guys, back in the olden times, movies used to stay in theaters, not for weeks, not for months, but sometimes for years. And I was able to see, I think I saw this movie in the movie theater and probably in 1981 after this film was released in 1979. I distinctly have memories of being in the movie theater and having seen this film and having an understanding of Star Trek at that time, which is incomprehensible to me. So 1981, I was about 5 years old. I was born in 76, so I'm an old guy. But my understanding of Star Trek was very, very nascent at that point. And then seeing this film helped none. In fact, it probably hurt some because it was just such a weird film. And, I'm sure we'll get to some anecdotes that I shared with Chris. I was lucky enough to travel down to close to where Chris and Rachel are, and we all got to see the film together. And I told him stories about what my memories of this film were. And they're ridiculous. But ridiculous in only the way that a 5 or 6 year old could actually muster up. And, ironically, I don't have a memory of watching the film since until we went to go see it a few weeks ago.
Quite a disparity, you might say.
You could say
it's really, really difficult for me to try and track the first time that I saw this movie. I just missed it in the theater in 1987 after I was born. Just by about a decade. It's only about a hair, but yes. It was one of the TV series that introduced me to Star Trek, but Star Trek has been a part of my life for so long that I just don't really remember much of my introduction to it. Star Trek, the motion picture, as a kid, I mean, the first time I saw it, we had a 25th anniversary VHS tape set of the first 5 movies, and they all, like the sides of the boxes all came together to form an image of the Enterprise. It was great. And the thing that sticks out to me as a kid watching Star Trek, the motion picture, is that I was always terrified of Commander Sonak dying in the transporter. Watching it in the theater, it did not go over much better. I think it's just the sound, which I think they changed in the director's edition, but the sound was always just so unnerving to me. I had the same kind of problem with all the skeletons in Raiders of the Lost Ark. The noises that they make, which they then also cycle in to the Indiana Jones ride in Disneyland, which, oh boy. But so, my first experience with Star Trek, the motion picture, was on VHS, and I've been fortunate enough now, instead of going, from the theater.
And Chris, that was the TV edition.
I actually don't know if it was or not. Maybe that was the only version that they released into that box set.
Yes, I believe the version in that box set was the expanded cut, not the TV, not the director's edition, but the expanded.
Well, and so when I was a kid too, like, I didn't really make much of a distinction between the tones of the first and second movies. It was just all Star Trek to me. Same thing with Batman. Adam West was Batman, so was Michael Keaton, so was Kevin Conroy. All of that stuff was just kind of lumped together in the minds of babes. But I've been fortunate enough now over the course of my life to actually see Star Trek, the motion picture, get better in terms of its visual fidelity and quality. And I got to see the director's edition. The full marketing force of Paramount was behind it for about 5 minutes, which was cool. And my appreciation for the movie only grows as I get older. So the idea of seeing it on the big screen was very, very enticing. The only other old Star Trek movie that I've seen on the big screen, and I say old just because it's the original crew, not because people are old who have seen it in the theater. Please don't make that mistake. I saw Star Trek 6, but I was a very young kid and I don't remember it. So the only other one that I've seen in the theater besides now the motion picture was Star Trek 2, which also came to theaters in a Fathom event a couple of years ago. The director's edition of that film, I believe. And I guess just transitioning to talking about the theatrical experience of watching this movie. the theater does this movie a lot of favors. And this is from someone who generally likes the movie. Like, I have no problem sitting through an hour of Enterprise porn. You know, I really like that scene. The music is beautiful. And I'm taken along an emotional journey because I have such a strong affinity and connection to that ship, just in my heart. So I love seeing all that stuff. And the theatrical exhibition, there aren't a whole lot of movies where I can say, oh, the movie was meant to be seen in the theater. But I do believe that Star Trek the Motion Picture falls under that category. And I was amazed at how easy it was for me to go along for the ride, because it didn't seem nearly as long as it seemed in some past viewings. And the joke, like, our theater wasn't very full, Cicero, but all the jokes landed with everybody that was there. And it seemed like the humor came through a little bit more somehow when watching it in the theater, but also just the scale of it is perfectly suited to a theater.
Yeah. And,
so Zaki, when you went in to see it this time in the theater, because you obviously know this movie very well, you and Glenn Greenberg did an exhaustive commentary over the director's edition for one of your other podcasts. What's it like actually sitting in the theater for the 40th anniversary at this point to watch, albeit the theatrical edition, but still Star Trek the Motion Picture on the big screen?
Yes. Well, so actually our commentary was for the theatrical.
Oh, it was?
Oh, yeah. And much to Glenn's chagrin, because he's a firm booster of the director's cut. But, the theatrical cut is pretty much the only version available via streaming and Blu-ray. So I was like, well, this is what we're doing, Glenn. So I bought him the Blu-ray, like the theatrical cut on Blu-ray, and sent it to him, because he didn't own it and he didn't want to. So I was like, here, there's a little extra for you. But no, yeah, I know this movie front, back, and sideways. I mean, I have watched it since I was a little kid, and I remember being, like 9 or 10, and sort of doing that. The dialogue is changed at the end. What more is there than the universe? Other planes of existence, higher levels of being, the existence of which cannot be proven. I can do those things since I was a kid. So I have always had a deep well of affinity for this film. Gorgeous effects. The music score is like one of the greatest in history, not just Star Trek history. And so for me, like you, I went to the Star Trek 2 screening a couple years ago. And unfortunately, the only one of the original batch that I was able to go to in the theater upon release was number 5. And so I'm trying to avail myself whenever I can watch these on the big screen. And the great thing for me is, honestly, and a broken record by now with you guys, but I get to share it with my kids. They've seen all these movies, but I'm like, hey guys, they're releasing Star Trek 1 in the theater. You want to come?
Hey man,
oh, yeah,
never stop saying that. Never stop saying that, because, at a certain point, your kids will always be your kids, but they'll stop being children. And you know what?
Yeah.
These are the things that they are going to remember. And if you can pass this on to other people that are listening, there are people that haven't had children yet. These are important lessons that they need to learn, that you can share beautiful, positive, passions of yours with them. And these are things they will never forget. They're immeasurably important and priceless memories.
Wow. That's it's meaningful for me to watch this with them, because I'm like, hey, I get to share something I love with them. But yeah, to your point, my oldest is at a point now, like I remember being 12 going on 13 and watching Next Generation every Saturday or whatever. So it is something that has now been passed along. And so to echo Chris, your point, having seen this movie a zillion times, it felt brand new watching it in the theater. it was so immersive, and it was funny because I posted about it on social media, and people are like, "Oh, I'm watching this now," and people respond like, "Oh, like it's a lot of money to pay for a match," or whatever, it's pretty funny. But I'm not a hater of this film. I cannot hate Star Trek: The Motion Picture, fully acknowledging its flaws, and there are a few. But it's like when you look like Star Trek 2, and Nick Meyer has said the Star Trek 2 would not have existed in the way that it existed if Star Trek: The Motion Picture did not make some of the mistakes that it made. Sure. Right? But even with those mistakes, man, I mean, it has aspirations. It's trying to do something. It's trying to be something. And the one regret I have as a Star Trek fan is I never got to experience the movie the way the fans of the era did, which was, here's this thing that we've been hoping and praying would actually happen, and oh my God, it's here, and we're in the theater watching it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
I said this in my retro review that I wrote about this movie like 10 years ago. I'm like, what must it have been like to be a Star Trek fan and see that first shot where like Captain Kirk's the train pulls in, and you just see his face through the window, and then the door opens. You're like, holy crap, that's Captain Kirk in a movie theater, That's huge. So a lot of affinity for this movie.
Yeah. Excellent. Very well said. Yes. Well, Cicero, long time between theatrical exhibitions.
Almost 40 years.
A little bit of life events have taken place in that intervening period. But also, it sounds like you hadn't seen the movie itself in a long time. So,
it definitely sits much better. There are a couple of things that I took away from this film, having actually watched it and being able to process it now instead of being a kindergartner watching this film. And one of the things that I really walked away with appreciation of was the interpretation that Carl Urban put on Bones. And I felt like he watched this film and then used this film as his reference for how he was going to play Dr. McCoy.
The Good Doctor is particularly grumpy in this movie.
And I feel like I just felt like, oh man, like this was like DeForest Kelley went to Carl Urban in a dream in his sleep and was like, watch this film. And he fully embodied that. And that was one of the things that was just like, oh man, is this like DeForest Kelley trying to play Carl Urban, trying to play himself? It was so weird for me. Having watched that, and I've really appreciated that. And then the other thing was when I saw this film initially, I didn't remember. I mean, I didn't remember a lot of things, and I'll go over the things that I did remember, which I think are hilarious. But what I didn't remember was the prolonged, almost erotic version of the Enterprise, to kind of the unfurling of the Enterprise that went on forever. And the reason I didn't
Sister, you know what Glenn called it? He says it's a wedding. It's Kirk seeing his bride. So,
and he got to see every nook and cranny of that bride.
The dry dock is the veil. That's funny. I like that.
But I didn't remember as a 5-year-old that scene being that long. But what I realized now, of course, is that we were watching the director's cut, and so the theatrical cut that I actually got to see in theaters wasn't as long as the one that we saw The other thing that I took away from this film, and these are very, very kind of like surface things that I think are significant, which is that like Zaki, like you said, the score was just so great. The score for this film, I can't even imagine what you could have been like if you were a Star Trek fan and you were there opening night, opening week, opening month, opening year, going to see this film and hearing a score so dramatically different from the show that you loved, that you know and love. Now, as fans of Next Generation, as modern day Star Trek fans, this is the theme song that we know, especially people that, most of the Star Trek fans that are listening to the show, are people that grew up or at least have, some affinity and some love for Star Trek: The Next Generation. This, of course, was the theme for that show, but this theme was introduced right here. And it was so dramatically different than anything that anyone had ever heard in connection with Star Trek. Like, how bold a decision that must have been to come out with this theme. And it was, I mean, demonstrably the right choice, right? Like it was everything. And you can't imagine Star Trek as at a theatrical level without it, or Star Trek in a modern way without it. And even as great as I think the themes are for the newer films, I don't think they hit the same way that theme did. That's the entirety of the score was great. And they definitely took the time to bring the classic, TOS theme into the film, and they brought it in great moments, and they were really smart about that. So it was great watching this film and having my dots connected. So I've been teasing this for a second. I'm going to now explain to all of the people, all of the debrief listeners, what Cicero Holmes, with 5-year-old Cicero Holmes, remembered of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So, young Cicero Holmes remembered that there was a guy in a yellow spacesuit floating around in space for some reason. At some point, everybody was on the bridge of the Enterprise, and things got really weird. And then there was a guy, and he was fighting with Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk, and for whatever reason. And there was a bald woman, and I don't know why that bald woman was around. And then Mr. Spock was in a red spacesuit outside for some reason. And at the end, the bald woman and that weird guy who was fighting with Captain Kirk kiss. The end. That was the movie. Right. That was the movie.
Covered the highlight.
And it was just such a weird movie. But what was funny, like my takeaway as an adult was like, oh, this movie was really like, the movie could have been called an episode of Star Trek, and it was just like Commander Decker and his quest for intergalactic strange. Like that, it was just like what a crazy like movie version of an episode. Like if we could take an episode and magnify it to a motion picture status, take some original idea and magnify it to a motion picture status, and we had a motion picture budget, what would we make? And this is what we got. This is what Star Trek: The Motion Picture, I think, really, really is.
And I think that's one of the things that I find so kind of charming about it is that it's uncompromising in its desire to say something. And you alluded to that before, Zaki. I mean, this movie does have a consciousness to it that is uncommon, especially nowadays with a lot of movies that have this kind of scale. I mean, the only one that I think probably outstrips it is 2001, but that's good company to be in when it comes to straight science fiction. And I know that our friend Kyle Sullivan from Trexpertise, this is his favorite Star Trek movie. And a younger me might have bristled at that idea a little bit, but what I love about Star Trek the Motion Picture at the end of the day is how stealthily, incredibly optimistic it is, especially at the end of it, where it literally tells the audience at the very end that the human adventure is just beginning. And what is really more Star Trek than that idea? And watching the movie in the theater, that just really hit me much harder than I was expecting it to, because of course I knew it was coming. But when all of that stuff actually went down on the screen, it hit me at the right moment. What do you take away, Zaki, when you've seen this movie countless numbers of times over the course of your life, and you know you're in the theater with this unobstructed and uninterrupted appreciation of the film as it's playing out in front of you, especially as someone who's conscious of the message and the tone that the movie conveys, at least at the very end. How does that land with you?
It obviously, you know, being 40, it plays in a different way, in a more profound way, you know, now than it would have throughout my life. But I mean, it's I guess I have the luxury of having continually experienced this film at pretty much every stage of my life, right? And you know, I mentioned earlier how like my favorite part is when you've got Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and they're doing the trifecta thing where they're figuring out what needs to happen at the very end, you know? And at that moment in the theater, these people sitting next to me, I don't know what the hell was happening with their phone, but it's just like making noise and talking and doing all kinds of stuff. I wanted to drop kick both of these people into the sun. I was so mad at them because I was like waiting for 2+ hours for that scene, which I love, you know.
I'm about to go to warp inside a solar system, you bastard.
But no, I mean, to me, you know, it's the inherent message, right? Which is logic. It's not enough. I mean, it's such a simple thing, but it played very differently now, you know, because obviously the older you get, the more you realize, like, you know, the joy in life, a truly centered life, comes from embracing both logic and emotion. And that sounds like stupidly naive, me saying it this way, but I mean, you know, that you have an appreciation for that as you get older, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we look at Spock's journey canonically, you realize what a key role this film has, right? Because this is the film where Spock makes the realization, right? So in other words, it set the direction for Spock for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously his compass gets reset after number 3 or whatever, but by the time we get to movie 6, he's right back to where he is at the end of this, which is serenity.
Yeah.
You know,
balance. Yeah, absolutely. And Cicero, the message of the movie, did it land in its intended spot for you, or did you find yourself maybe still kind of put off a little bit by erotic Constitution clash?
I definitely met the ending with a little bit of cynicism, but upon reflection on the film, like I really tried to take some time to think about what the film set out to do, and then what the film must have meant in 1979 for Star Trek, for Star Trek fans that had been waiting the better part of a decade and a half to see this show return in a real way. As Zaki said, as you've said already, Chris, this film, or Wrath of Khan, and all of the films that precede it, would not have happened if this film, would not have happened in the way that they were able to happen if this film did not take place. And I understand. I understand the more modern fan, the more modern Star Trek fan who has a level of disdain or a kind of a dismissive tone towards this film, because it is tonally very, very different from all the films that precede it. But as you said, Chris, it's very much like 2001. It is very much an opus. It is very much a film about grandeur and being spectacular, but then also living up to Gene Roddenberry's vision of what Star Trek could have been. It's the very best of who we can be as people. In so much that everything, like, the villain is us, but we can change that if we just embrace who we are. And embrace all sides of ourselves. But I think it was important for them to kind of get that opus out of the way to show that they can make Star Trek on a grand scale. And then I think every film that preceded it, including the TNG films, were given the space to basically be big budget, longer versions of episodes, than, where the protagonists and the antagonists were characters that we were familiar with from the television series that the show was based on, and just basically bigger, better versions of episodes of the TV. And I don't think any of that stuff would have been possible if this opus of a film, of a motion picture, didn't come out and wasn't as successful in accomplishing his mission as it was. In kind of winding this discussion down, because unfortunately we're running a little over the allotted time that we have, but some of my feelings, especially on re-review of Star Trek the Motion Picture, are actually encapsulated of all entities, Q. Q gave a pretty rousing speech to end the series finale of TNG, straight to Captain Picard's face. They're alone in the courtroom, and I feel like, in terms of the Star Trek film series, Q's words are apt when he said, "We wanted to see if you had the ability to expand your mind and your horizons, and for one brief moment, you did. For that one fraction of a second, you were open to options you had never considered. That is the exploration that awaits you, not mapping stars and studying nebulae, but charting the unknown possibilities of existence." And for all of the faults that do exist, I totally agree with the statements that have been thrown around concerning those. Star Trek the Motion Picture, at least in my mind, feels the least, and this might not be the right word, the least terrestrial of every Star Trek movie. Oh. It feels the least bound by the rules that govern the world in which we live, and it feels like it is stretching into that unknown that is conjured by saying the phrase "the final frontier." And that's why I really admire this movie. It's not my favorite Star Trek movie, don't get me wrong, but the scope is still so impressive, and seeing it on the big screen, it has aged remarkably well in terms of its visual effects. That was something that honestly really surprised me. Still could do with a new coat of paint, and there are rumors that are going around that it could be getting a new 4K scan
in the near future, including the director's edition, which is weirdly only mastered in standard definition resolutions. They need to change that. But considering the levels that this movie reaches, I think it's a hell of an example of a generally very commercially successful franchise like Star Trek going all in on its concept. And that's one of the reasons I really admire it. But Zaki, what are your final thoughts in briefly revisiting Star Trek the motion picture and seeing it on the big screen for the first time? How does it leave you right now?
Optimistic about the human adventure.
Beautiful. What more could you ask for? Cicero, as someone who has absorbed this movie relatively recently, and you're now able to tie those threads from 5-year-old Cicero into the full experience of the movie, what are your just basic final thoughts on Star Trek?
I am incredibly in awe of the creators of this film in their ability to be bold, to think in a way that was just allowing themselves to really dream and believe in themselves and believe in humanity, and really created something beautiful.
Very well said. Well, maybe we'll have to go a little bit deeper into Star Trek the motion picture. Maybe we'll have to follow Zaki's lead at some point. Zaki, I don't know how willing you would be to sit in on 12 more movie commentaries, but that might be something that we have to think about. If you're, hey,
I'm all about
all the better then. Well, so I think we all like this movie. That's a good thing. And of course the venerable Mrs. Rachel Baker Clow could not be here tonight. Very unfortunate. It's been a sausage fest the whole time. Sorry about that. But she enjoyed the movie too, seeing it on the big screen. But I'll let her speak for herself the next time that she's on with us. But as for right now, that is going to do it for episode number 46 of Discovery Debrief. We're getting really close to 50, you guys.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please like and follow us on our social media channels, and if you'd be so kind, we'd also appreciate it if you wrote a review for the show on iTunes or Facebook. It only takes a minute, and we'll be happy to read your review on the air when it's posted. If you have any questions, you can follow the show on Twitter at DSC Debrief, where you can also find all of our individual Twitter handles, and feel free to send us questions through Twitter, our Facebook like page, or by emailing us at hailingfrequencies@discoverydebrief.com. Please be sure to set your courses for this feed for future episodes, and be sure to join us as we convene next time to discuss the increasingly bright future of those bold adventures into the final frontier. We might have to get together after New York Comic Con because it sounds like there's going to be a lot of Star Trek news, but don't know that for sure, but might be a good occasion. As always, though, until we meet again, please go boldly, my friends.